reducing the digital divide, universal service funds, these types of things. Fiber backbone projects, building fiber optic networks, both government and private sector doing those. A lot of work and investment has gone on into education of 21st century skills we heard about earlier. And I was particularly impressed by the talk of the work from home policy in Mauritius, which is a really good way of driving some sort of internet usage. But we're starting to see, now that we've had some change in policy, and maybe it's been, maybe we're having some success, and some of the internet service providers in Africa and global content providers are having success in Africa, we may be starting to see a bit of a backlash, maybe a backlash against, not liking that success, or maybe not liking some of the less, not everything about the internet is good, so maybe some of these backlash policies are coming as a reaction to that. But some of the bad policies we're seeing, things like taxation, over-taxation, duties being added on, additional to VAT and on certain things, certain types of services, whether it be bandwidth or social media. We're seeing things heading towards, licensing of bloggers, licensing of content providers. So we're seeing impositions being posted on people in Africa who are creating some of the local content. Whilst we're pushing for local content, and we're having countries where bloggers are being asked to pay a $1,000 license a year, these types of things. Some of these things heading towards censorship of the internet, and certain powers looking at blocking content on the internet, and even trending towards an increased national or governments taking control and having more nationalization of networks. And then we're having ugly policies, things that are really looking at really causing potential damage to everything we've done. Internet shutdowns have become prevalent, some of these, some people who are maybe those people who have been blogging and blogging about their government, maybe human rights violations have even been committed against those people, and we're seeing them arrested. And we're seeing some of those national projects that are coming from government projects, seeing those heading towards reinstatement of state monopolies. So while some countries have progressed by opening up the market and having liberalization and deregularization, we're seeing some countries heading backwards and creating monopolies, creating international gateways that are monopolized by one companies, or creating state backbone systems. So that's the summary, the good, the bad, and the ugly, what it's all about. I just want to ask the panel, first of all, just to go through, just introduce themselves, say what it is, what they do, where they're from, a bit about what's there, but just talk about the examples of good policy, bad policy, and ugly policy, what they're seeing in their countries, and what impact those good policies, ugly policies, and bad policies are having on the development.
Thanks, Ben. Just to reintroduce myself, my name is Kyle Spencer. In this context, I'm representing the Uganda Internet Exchange Point. As I mentioned, the appearing personals were in Kampala. And as I often tell people when they ask me about Uganda's telecommunications ecosystem, we actually have a very advanced ecosystem. Uganda wisely was one of the earlier countries in the region to liberalize its infrastructure in the early 90s, coming from a state monopoly to a highly competitive market we have today. At the exchange point, for example, we have over 27 networks connected, and that's not something you see everywhere. We have shared towers, we have shared fiber, and that's not something that the government has always driven, although it wasn't the case of shared towers, but shared fiber was an experimental project by Google to create a dark fiber network. And so all this has led to extremely rapid wholesale bandwidth reductions. So for example, in 2009, we were paying something like $5,000 a megabit, and now I think wholesale is down around $5. Not unlike the rest of the region, but still wouldn't be possible without the conditions that we have today, which are quite advanced in Uganda. But unfortunately, that seems to be going in reverse due to a number of policies that have been implemented over the last, I would say, primarily 5 to 7 years. Things like the OTT tax, as we call it, where the government has mandated that telecommunications providers tax social media services and other platforms of its kind. We've got a ban on all online news sources that don't have a license in Uganda. The government has banned pornography. They've recently said that if you're an influencer on social media, you need to pay a $20 tax. They passed a national broadband policy last year that calls for the large-scale renationalization of all backbone infrastructure, centralized international gateways, and control of the CCTLD, etc. This is obviously very concerning to us because we have spent many years as an industry building what we think is a very efficient, liberalized telecommunications industry in Uganda. And these policies, if carried out, which some of them have been, threatened to completely undermine the economy as well as impose significant restrictions on society. So that's our perspective in Uganda.
Bonsoir.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zin Ibrahim Mohammed. I'm the representative of the telecommunication company in Chad pertaining to policy, internet policy. As you know, in the Central Sub-African region, and especially in Chad, we have quite a lot of issues. And for your information, we will get the opportunity to host a Chad IX in about 2 weeks. So to us, yes, it's important, and we would like to share best practices and the way we manage our policies. We can consider that Chad is a bad student pertaining to policies and telecommunication policies. Without saying that, we have a lot of internet shutdown, and we also have a lack of will and political will, lack of policies. Well, at the moment, we do have a minister who is trying to push forward, and we are leveraging on his term in order to bring Chad at a certain level, whereas to have all infrastructures and proper and clear policies. So, in a nutshell, the situation in Chad, it's not at all a flexible situation, and we are relying on our ministry and our regulator in order to help us to pull through. And by the end of the year, we need to have a reliable policy and proper infrastructures and existing entities in our country, and also invite new stakeholders in order to give a new boost to this economy. Thank you.
I'm going to take this from a broader perspective. It'll show you how old I am. About 15 to 20 years ago, we were working on bringing subcables in, submarine cable backhaul liberalization, the examination of better broadband policies, fiber deployments, and trying to create that environment, the enabling environment, with regulators and policymakers, establishing independent regulators to help broaden out the market, bring in more competition. We saw so much change. Karen and Machuki had shown you over the last 10 years the different changes in volume of traffic, number of IXPs. Ben can tell you probably kilometers of fiber installed. And then all of a sudden now we're seeing globally, and some with a lot of impact here on the continent as well, a rollback of some of the submarine cable backhaul openness, and people looking at border crossings as places for security examination of traffic, right? So whether it's a submarine cable landing station or the cross-border connectivity conduits, we're hearing that the gateways need to be nationalized for security purposes. This is concerning, obviously, for all of us when we're talking about that ecosystem to enable more cross-border connectivity for resiliency and redundancy. There is some hope, of course, if we can all come together and look at ways that companies can, in a country, be more prepared. I think this is something that if you're looking at a checklist of who you have to talk to in the government, it's not just one ministry anymore. Is it the Ministry of Education you also have to talk to, or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs? Is it the customs officials? One thing that has been a preoccupation for me, because I used to work at a different ministry in the United States called the Department of Commerce, equipment. I've never seen so many challenging policies where equipment gets held up at borders, or these new warehouse fees that kicked us once when the switches were sitting for over a month and a half in a warehouse. In one country, I'm not going to name the country, I had to go back to the country after 3 or 4 months to get the switches out of what I called jail. So I think we all have to work together to hit up some of the different ministries to try and figure out what's your checklist. Am I going to get hung up from a business perspective at the border with the equipment getting into the country? That's a huge thing. If you're trying to deploy a cache, get your routers, your servers, your switches in, and they can't enter the country. So you're delayed by months and months and months, and the business cost is something that if you help calculate for the ministries, they might actually start to think about ways to roll that back, hopefully. So no, it's no longer just one ministry that you have to deal with, it's several, if not 3 or 4. And how do you put that political pressure on some of the ministries to help you bring in that network development, because better networks, cheaper networks, faster networks are going to help with socioeconomic development. We don't have to fight that fight anymore. When I first started doing regulatory and policy work, I used to get challenged by different officials who'd say, well, prove it. Prove that connectivity equals economic development. We now know from the World Bank that connectivity does. It increases GDP. So that fight should be over, but I feel like we're actually having to go backwards and start those checklists and work with different companies. In South Africa, we've been working on, and across parts of the continent, on something called community networks. Similar idea to somewhat of IXPs, bottom-up development. It's unbelievable to look at the licensing, the funding, the policy-related issues that stop us everywhere. Small networks where there aren't networks. Well, why wouldn't we want that? Why wouldn't we want connectivity if it equals development? We have to take a look at licensing. We've got to look at the funding again. And universal service funds, I would posit, should go to fund IXPs, should fund community networks. So what is it that's stopping us? Is it new regulators and policymakers who just are new to the game? Do we have to start over? Do we need to do more reports? And this is something we're probably going to be working on this year, is to reboot that Nigeria-Kenya study that Karen and Machuki started in 2012. To prove to people through measurements, different economic data, volume of traffic across the continent, here are the facts. I think, Ben, we were saying it's evidence-based policymaking at its finest, but we may all need to start working together again, and all of you who are IXPs, put that data up on your website. It will help us, because we can start to collect this data and work across different governments to prove that this is important for the continent and for socioeconomic development. So South Africa has been looking at changing their funding, not just for to take away not take away USF, but add in another funding mechanism for networking. And that would be super helpful, we at least thought, because if USF is hung up, there are billions of dollars hung up in USF funding around the world. The Association for A4AI, the Association for Affordable Internet, did a study last year. There's at least 16 million hung up on the continent in universal service funding. If you could open some of that up for IX funding, for other small network development, it's amazing to me what could happen. And so we sit here and think, okay, we come here with 21 IXs. It's amazing that the change has taken place, but what can we do to blow the doors off that more?
Yeah, some very good points raised, I think, and really to sort of follow on from exactly what Jane's been talking about. It is in government. Government is not one thing. We think of government, yeah, but it's a multitude of agencies, and really, as we're making progressive policies, as we've had change and opening up, it's kind of generally started with a regulator. And even what kicked off liquid telecom is when we saw a regulatory change in one of the countries where we first built fiber, relaxing from the regulator. We had to get other agencies to still allow us to do that, but it was the regulator that relaxed. And Zena picked on this very strongly. She said, we are relying upon the ministry and the regulator to support us in opening up, and it's really important they do. So, I mean, are there any regulators in the room today? Anybody who's a regulator, put your hand up. Okay, we only have one. Any more? 2, 3? So there's a colleague of mine, there's another British man in Africa, a guy called Ben Mann, who works for IBM, and he's in Nairobi. And earlier this year, we were having a sort of discussion about this, and you know, he pointed out, and he got in this forum to point out that regulators are your friends. Right? Yes, you might have a tussle with them about this and that and regulation, but regulators are their friends. So he started Hug a Regulator Day, and anybody who's there, who's sitting near a regulator, he asked them to get up and give that regulator a hug. So if anybody in the audience is sitting next to one of those people who put their hand up, put your hands around them and give them a big hug, because regulators are our friends. So that's the point. I think in the main, regulators might cause us pain sometimes when we're having fights with them, but they should be our friend. If we want to progress, we're going to need a friendly regulator. We're going to need somebody who is, you need progressive policy. Ministry of ICTs normally are thinking of progressive policy. Regulators are one of the instruments of the Ministry of ICT to enforce policy. But then there are other agencies and different things within government who may not be our friends, whether they be revenue authorities, film classification boards, whatever they think they're doing, they have a mandate to do something else. So I think the next question to the panel is, who are the other, who is driving policy? Who are the other agencies besides the regulators? Who are the ones making the decisions? Some countries, you have a very clear leadership from the top. The president or prime minister will be driving ICT policy, but in other places there's conflicting interests within government. Who are the friends? Who are your adversaries? Who are supporting you in your country with your policy? Who are the ones dragging it back? And have you thought about those people? Have you thought, understood what might be motivating them, why they might be thinking about doing this policy? And have you thought about at least understanding their positions so that you know where to? It's mapping your stakeholders. It's mapping your adversaries and your support and your supporters. Have you done that? And do you know who they are?
So I guess I'll start again with the Uganda perspective. We unfortunately do not have a very good relationship with our regulator, but we do have good relationships with other parts of the government. When it comes to trying to figure out who is driving policy in Uganda, it's our assessment from experience, though not a deliberate mapping process, that the state security agencies are driving a lot of the policies, as well as the Ministry of Finance in some cases. And on the other hand, and I think their motivations are sort of self-explanatory, but on the other hand, you have agencies, for example, that run the government backbone, that provide internet to a lot of ministry offices and stuff, that have a lot of eyeballs. So, for example, they have a good relationship with us as the internet exchange point because they benefit from the connectivity that we provide. In fact, when we were implementing our sustainability model recently, that particular government agency was one of the first to pay for a full year of service. We also, of course, have a very good relationship with the Revenue Authority because they benefit similarly from having the online services and such. But often it's a shifting landscape. We haven't always had a bad relationship with our regulator, for example. It became particularly contentious and troublesome when their mandate was sort of carved into two to create another government agency, and those two agencies started fighting each other and trying to grab us. And so it's a long story, but sometimes our enemies become our friends and our friends become our enemies, and it can shift. But ultimately, I think sitting at the top, we have state security and financial interests.
Well, having good relationships with regulators, which is good. I mean, when we talk about government, as you know, Chad is has borders with 6 countries. So far, as security is concerned, we do have a challenge. And this is coming from Boko Haram, maybe you heard of it. Hence the due diligence that we have to do in order to find a certain resilience with the regulators. Yes, they may have good intentions towards us. We start to work on those policies, and then you have the Ministry of Internal Affairs who would come to you and ask you what kind of role can the state have in this issue. But once again, the huge issue that we have is extremism on social media. And we've been spending quite a lot of money in this regard. So far, what is the most difficult thing is the understanding of the government. And as I told you, we're sharing borders with 6 countries, so we need to be very careful and in protecting our people, but at what price? For the time being, we're still negotiating. We're trying to talk to our decision makers, given that the digital world is quite a fast one. If they keep on hindering our work, we won't be able to go forward, but we can restructure things and go forward and show some flexibility. But the objective for us is for everyone to sit down and understand the stakes. So the best way for us is to sit down and find the best compromise and solution in order to have proper policies for the benefit of the population and the government in general. So I guess with perseverance we will get there. Thank you.
I think some of the answer is in this room to your question, because so many people here are doing business. You're bringing in equipment, you're talking to ministries, you're working with regulators, sharing that information across this FPIF group or through FIX as well. FIX could be a homing ground for some data. You know, I don't know how you would do it, but you could think about the way, as an association, you could be a neutral place for data about what's happening in X, Y, or Z countries so that you could help educate people faster. Because I think, you need better business. To do business, you need to be fast, and you don't want to be slowed down. But also, we want to do what's right for the country. So the question is, how can you share that data across people in this room or with other regulators and policymakers who are the positive angle of the equation? I know, Kyle, you now have a different situation in your country, but before it looked pretty good. When I was a policymaker, I didn't know what BGP was 20 years ago. So Martin Levy, if he's in the room, could raise his hand, maybe. I reached out to Martin and actually some other folks at PCH and said, I'm going to get my toes kicked at this meeting at the ITU because they want to change BGP. Of course, they couldn't, but they wanted to, which was changing the mindset of the regulators and the policymakers in the room. So I had a couple phone calls with Martin and a couple with some other people, and I was armed with that data. Don't underestimate the work that the regulator and the policymakers are trying to do, or if it's a new regulator, they don't know what they're doing. They may not even know the market. So if we can bring more data to them about the market, what it can do, I know I'm not trying to be a Pollyanna because I know with the security agencies that's tricky. But what is it that's creating this panic around the world where we have to, quote, shut down connectivity or filter every packet? I mean, come on. This is slowing down your networks. It's not good for the economy or for the community. But what is it that we can do collectively, because we can share that information to try and change the game, because it's not helping anyone in business, it's not helping people in the country. So what do we do to help the regulators and the policymakers? We may have to work on the most influential countries, right, to leverage them. Because if they can then start to talk to their neighbors, An example of this is the African Telecom Union. I know for many of you, you may or may not know them, but John Omu from Kenya is the new head of the ATU. He was at a policymaker session that we hold at the IETF meetings. Those policymaker sessions have been eye-opening. We bring in policymakers so they understand what the IETF is, how the standards work in a fully neutral way. Many of the IETF participants come in to describe how the protocols are RFCs are put together. We will often do some training on IXs, community networks, some other related issues, encryption. The idea is that it's a neutral space for them to ask questions where they may not want to ask questions in a big room like this. So we try and create a neutral space with a lot of information where they can make their own decisions. And Dawit and I had a chat with John at one point, and he kept asking a lot of questions about some of the things we were working on. And I think Machuki then talked to John later. He is a huge influencer potentially across many different countries that if we could leverage him, he could help change the game in some countries. So it's figuring out who those people are, mapping that out, and then going after some of the key change makers.
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce what you were saying about the data, because as tricky as our situation is, I think it would be worse today if we had not been able to counter some of the proposals from the government with data, right? And that's thanks largely to ISOC and many others that have gone there and done that research, where we can sort of show with some clarity that what they're proposing may be ineffective, right? So definitely.
We could also help someone like Riza, who in 2 weeks is going to help set up the IXP. If you had data that showed the development aspects of this, the economic side, and what the benefits are to counterbalance the security-mindedness of some of the countries. I mean, having more access out of a country, across a border or through the sea is more important, I would think, that redundancy. So it's more of an ecosystem we're looking at now, where we have to hit different points, I think, rather than just say, this one thing is good. I mean, I don't remember, Ben, it was, I think, 2014, July, there was an article called Many Rivers to Cross in The Economist. It was about fiber being strung over a bridge, which involved 6 ministries between Zimbabwe and South Africa, because it was an old bridge, so you had an historic Ministry of Historic Bridges, or whatever it was, the telco, the regulators, the border people. And eventually, I think somebody got in a boat and took the fiber across the river. You guys are like, forget it, we're just not gonna put it on the bridge. But do we have to come up with these solutions where you're just jumping in the boat? Their bees were stinging this guy as they were taking the fiber across the river. It was a great article, because it showed almost the silliness of having to go through months and months and months of red tape, and then the simple solution was to get in a boat and take the fiber over the river. So is it these examples, would it help some of the regulators? I don't want to pick on you because you're the only one in the room, but what is it you need to know to help you do a better job so that it's not a hard decision about the IXP? You're like, great, awesome, those people they know what they're doing, bottom up. You could be like Michelle, be on the management committee or an observer status or something. I think in Lesotho, the regulator was an observer, but just said, go forth, this looks great. And we've ended up training people in the regulator in Lesotho, because Vodacom had asked us to do that training for their staff and for the regulator in the ministry, because that spread out more of the technical knowledge in the country, but also because his team wanted to be better networkers. So there's that knock-on effect of where some of us could do more training and just sort of even things out. Find your pressure points.
Yeah, I'm glad you remembered the article in The Economist, Jane, because it was about my boss, Mr. Nick Rudnick, our CEO. That actually happened in about 2010. And I we have a very nice video of the whole thing, and I wanted to show that video at PIF 2012. I wasn't allowed to for various reasons, but you know, it's about that multi-agency. We crossed a river, which was the Zambezi River, with fiber. We actually crossed it by about 3 different ways, because we had regulatory boundaries from so many different agencies. I had a plan A, a plan B, a plan C, and when we did crossover with fiber, that was the actual final implementation some year later of the Plan A, having done Plan B and C. But we were even afraid to talk about it for about 4 years till the statute of limitation had passed, because we didn't want some of the agencies who blocked it knowing where that was. We didn't want them seeing the video and seeing that site and realizing that we'd got one over them. They denied us access into a certain bridge, so we'd done something over a river, and we didn't want them finding out. So we were kind of hiding, sometimes if you have a blocker in one agency, is really the point I'm making. If you've got a blocker in one agency, this road or this revenue authority here is blocking something there, you go another way. And that's one way to get around your adversaries, is to go somewhere else. But it's hard to deal with an adversary that isn't going to budge. Yeah. But then on this, with the different stakeholders that are influencing, maybe not all the stakeholders are influencing some of these policies. They're maybe not all local. Some might be international stakeholders who are influencing it, and even terrorism, Boko Haram, you've mentioned, is one of those. Other people, World Bank, American government, Chinese government, Israelis, these are some of the players. Even my government, British government, I think we're the good guys, but, foreign governments are influencing some of these policies. Do we know, do we know who the foreign entities are? Are they there? Do we know anything about them? Do we know what those conversations are happening?
Well, in Uganda, the information is all a little unclear, but in general, we have the Chinese interfacing a lot with the Ugandan government around telecommunications, infrastructure, and presumably policy based on what we're seeing of late. We also have the Israelis, when it comes to surveillance and state security, doing a lot of business in that area with the government. But beyond that, I can't really say.
I'll give you one example where we did turn something back, but it was at the ITU. Some people shudder when they hear the name the ITU, but the ITU also does some great work. But we were at a big treaty conference, and someone wanted to put a resolution, which is a piece of paper, which sounds silly to some of you, but some governments take them very seriously. They wanted to put a resolution together that would harden IXP infrastructure. And by harden it, clarify or class the standards that should be and the equipment that should be used in an IX. And we had an all-out effort to turn that back, and we managed to do that along with PCH and some others who were in the room and some friendly governments. But it took 2 weeks at this 3-week meeting, which, who goes to a 3-week meeting? But anyway, some of the UN types do. But you have to work through some of that in order to prevent what someone in our organization calls the bad idea fairy, somebody that runs around thinking that they know something about the architecture, they want to harden it, standardize it, suggest certain types of equipment, which for me, I just don't understand that. We want lots of different equipment types. We want to have as much freedom over the borders. But you do have to spend time, or some people do, to try and work with those policymakers and find them where they are and try and do what you can to influence them. I can say my own country is a bit embarrassing when it comes to connectivity. There are a lot of people trying to fight off local access network development. We are seeing more internet exchange points coming up, actually in the United States. It's interesting, Canada as well. But some of the debate about security and encryption is coming out of the US, right? Some government authorities want backdoors into encryption. Complicated. Not something we support, but it's happening. So what do you do?
Yeah, so I mean, and the last question I have is really, as we before we open to the audience, but as we get to talk about policy, not all laws are just imposed without any consultation. There are various forums everywhere we go that we get to discuss policy, and some of these are global forums. You're mentioning ITU, ATU, there's Smart Africa as well, which is covering a lot of Africa. And then other, this SADC have got their own telecoms organization. And then others are national forums, and there may be consultations on specific bills or rules that come up. There may be workshops that are called and forums. The industries might organize themselves into ISP associations. They may have, in Kenya, we have a wider private sector alliance, and which is kind of an umbrella body of all the different BMOs in Kenya, and so the ISP association is a member of that, and that then has a seat at the government table and can pretty much call a minister for a meeting, by being part of that. So, what forums do we have? Do we have enough forums in our national level and global level? And when we get the chance to have those forums, are we organizing ourselves? Are we preparing? Are we as an industry sitting if there's going to be a consultation meeting or a roundtable meeting, are we as an industry sitting down beforehand, preparing together, or making a one position? Or are we having divided meetings where different players in the industry are having side conversations and diverting their interests, which is a big problem. But if we are organizing industry, are we then really organizing? Are we collecting data? Are we funding research? Are we doing things to fund higher education to do research on these things so we can say this is attributed research? Are we driving the policy in the right way? Are we thinking about it, or are we just riding along sometimes?
One of the challenges we faced in Uganda one of the challenges we face in Uganda is that the community has had a hard time getting together on a lot of different layers, right? We don't really have strong civil society across the country, and within telecommunications, it's the same story. Although of late, it's getting better. We have things like the ICT Association of Uganda and the Private Sector Foundation, et cetera. They have some voice because of the number of voices behind them and their membership. And in some cases, the government has taken their positions on board and actually made changes to policy. Although I must say that hasn't generally happened when it comes to telecommunications policy strictly, though it has with some other ICT policies. And I think that's one of the things that makes it easy for these things to get passed without a lot of scrutiny. But there have also been some systemic changes in the way policies get passed in Uganda that have reduced involvement from oversight organs like Parliament, et cetera, and have given more unilateral power to the ministry and others that would be the implementers now. But yeah, definitely, I think it's good to work with the community, and that has helped us in what way it can in Uganda.
For a better organization, we have civil society behind us, principally the Society of Chad. They're doing a lot of efforts to get everybody on the same table to find solutions. We think that together, whether private sector, government, or civil society, we can sensitize through the universities, and the better the universities take the telecom policy in their hands, the better for us. So we can talk through interconnections. The advantage that we have is that government listens to civil society organizations that are fighting and sensitizing people in the telecom and internet sector. And they're fighting to find compromise. So I think here up to the end of 2019, we hope to have a flexible enough system so that the same way we're relying on proper infrastructure, and we think that we can have a very major policy regarding these questions.
She knows the checklist in her country, and I'm really so happy to hear that civil society is part of that. What we can do is also work through the regulatory bodies, the regional regulatory bodies. I know Machuki's had to work with AACO for years to talk to them about IXs and cross-border connectivity. We just have to keep going back, I think, somehow get observer status, get the checklist together, right? Karen showed a flower chart. For some people, they like to group different organizations they have to work with that way, or just a simple checklist and compare notes with each other. Did you go to AACO? Did someone go to CRASA? Or someone at WATRA? And what was on the agenda? Let's get the issues on the agenda. I know Dawit goes to many meetings, and we could talk to some of those regulatory bodies. We can hit some of the development organizations that we work with and come up with a consistent agenda that's good for business, good for civil society, good for all of us, right? But figure out what that is, because not everyone can do the same thing, not everyone's got the same skill sets, but where can we spread out and do that together across different organizations?
And to reinforce that, I mean, my original statement on this issue omitted the regional and international, but you're entirely right. I mean, we've also had a lot of support from the international and regional community over time, and that has been a significant help. And as well, we've had a lot of support from industry. We do have our allies in industry, and if enough of them speak up, regardless of whether they're organized into an organization or an association, the government does tend to listen because they have economic influence. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think following on from this, we're getting together for 3 days here, but following on from this, I think the message is keep talking, and never has it been so easy as it is now, and you know, on some of these policy issues that we are fighting combined, you know, we have WhatsApp groups, and people in those groups some are in London, some are in USA, some are in Uganda, some are in Kenya, and then we discuss these things, and articles that come out are shared about them, and you know, research that's being done. If somebody has in a court case, we share and talk about those things, even though we may be thousands of kilometers away, and you can very easily in today's day and age make these chat groups and things and keep on those subjects, even if it's completely outside of a normal body like an ISP association or a formal meeting, which, you know, it may be difficult to get a formal meeting where you all come round. We spend a lot of money to come here. You may even spend a lot of money to have an ISP association meeting somewhere, but it doesn't cost you anything to make a WhatsApp group, so keep talking. I want to open the question up to the audience. It's very good so far, but I want to see what the audience have to ask us. I'll be very interested.
Or to contribute. Yeah.
Come on, there must be somebody. Shala's left the room.
I would ask, like, how often do you just reach out to someone that you work with in a government just to say, hey, what's on the top of your agenda these days? When I worked in government, if people called me at the last minute with something they needed urgently, I was far less inclined to spend a lot of time helping them unless they had been, you know, working with me throughout the year. So one thing I would say is just don't leave it till when you have a crisis. Get those relationships shored up and go to meetings, as you were saying, across the continent or wherever you region, and just make sure you know those people. Because if you call them at the last minute in a crisis, they will try and help you usually, but it's better if you're just always keeping those relationships up to date.
It's a really important point, and you know, it's not just about calling them when you need something, but you know, if you have something to offer them as well, then call them if you've got something for them. But also, if you just want to call, say hi, how are you doing, and just keep something up, do that as well. I think it's really important that you don't become a friend in need all the time. You might be taken advantage of if you're a friend indeed, but if you're just actually there having a relationship, you keep it going. Yeah. So there's no questions from the audience. I think then, Michuki, we can wind up for the day. Maybe some concluding remarks from everybody as we haven't had any questions.
I guess the only thing I would end with is offer to train people or to explain to them what your network does or your equipment. Quiet meeting, bring in as many people you can from the ministry and the regulator and explain to them what the network is that you might run or the equipment that you provide or what an IX is. Just remind them. And it could be a quiet info session because government officials often don't want to ask questions in a big room because they're embarrassed to admit they don't know something.
Zina?
For us, we're relying a lot on the sharing of experiences, discussing with between each other to find a lot of compromise to solve our problems. We believe that with the backup of the whole community, we're going to be able to really solve our problems and say that if also have a voice to communicate and get our messages through, and then thank them for the support that they've given us and sit down together and do good work. Thank you.
Right, and I suppose. Oh, sorry.
We have one question.
Yeah, go
Question
ahead.
from Mr. Mioli-Kishordan, Professor Mioli-Kishordan.
It's me. Is it one?
Yes.
It's merely again from Kenya. I just wanted the panelists to speak a little about regulatory culture, or even government policy culture, by dominant operators, by commercial systems.
What was the question?
Regulatory capture.
Regulatory capture. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So one country I worked in where I did help create a regulator, it was definitely captured. The incumbent was extremely powerful. You have to bring in as many different voices as possible and other ministries. You've got to find the heaviest hitters, right? What is the biggest industry that you could bring in to talk to the regulator and say, this isn't helping, nothing's cheaper, better, faster, and why are we captured? But you may have to talk to senior government officials about replacing some of the senior officials. And Professor Mayole, we should have talked about universities as one, and I think Riza did, as a critical factor in providing connectivity and education. But with regulatory capture, the best you can do is try and educate, and if they're not going to listen, then you've got to try and make a more structural change, or force competition in the country. We forced it by bringing in another mobile operator. As soon as that second mobile operator came into the country, it blew the doors off capacity. Their network went down in the first week because so many people, there was latent demand. But I think you often have to force the competition if you've got a captured regulator, or you've got to talk to the ministry or the prime minister, somebody that can make that change. Because you'll waste a lot of time if you're trying to make that change yourself.
Yeah, and there's regulatory capture and there's state capture, and we've come from a lot of the countries that are connected now have come from that position. They've come from dark times and have already progressed to something else. And maybe there's still fear of those dark times and maybe regression back to those dark times at sometimes some events. Anyone want to add anyone on that one? No? Okay.
I can't hear the question, sorry.
Slow down for the translator. Say again.
No, I can't even hear him.
Oh, he can't hear you. The translator can't hear.
Yeah, can you use another mic, please? Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I came to represent Burundi, Agency of Communication. I'm so sorry, guys. I can't. It's bouncing in all directions. Pas tellement rien. Faut pas comprendre. Les raisonnements. C'est pas clair. Dans l'email. In that case, Afrinic, we got resources from the association did not put into place, and as a regulator we saw he had a problem, and then somebody else tried to put into place, and the Afrinic member had already gone through this, and we had informed him. And as a regulator, we saw we had a problem. We had a problem with the internet. Yes. And the government. So then the government said they had to put into place the IXP. Then we gathered all the operators and we created an association. And it's through the association that we've been able to put into place the exchange point. So as a regulator, we have a high hand on that association, but it's the association that's managing the IXP. Between the members of the association, because we're at the beginning of this, they hosted this, so they hosted the infrastructure that we put into place, and he also promised that for the first year he won't be charging the transits, but he says that it won't 10 megabits of the resources. No, the resources that we've already given. So the resources that we're using. So this is what they gave us to. We also have at the level of the visibility. We wanted some visibility in that exchange. I really apologize, guys, but he was talking very fast and it was very difficult. Thank you very much for the Burundi example. The example that you have, the difference with you, we have the chance that it's the historical regulator that's going to be hosting. Here the civil society is doing its work. Well, the Internet Society, they are our interface, and the most difficult today is that our development, our agency of TIC development, ITC development, has the high hand, and the sensitization has worked, and we all sat around a table through our new Ministry of Internet, and they said that the IBU would be managed by them and the rest by the society. Our problem is slightly different because our problem is politics is playing a very, very high role. They can decide to lock up the internet or cut it altogether. So this is a real handicap. So we're using go towards these people. What we do through the civil society, we've been able to get all the ministries sitting around the same table. Our example today, if we can put a very nice policy in place, I trust that by the end of the year we'll be leading the Francophone world. Sorry, Mr. Luc.
Yeah, I think that's a good message. I think progressive policy is going to be a benefit rather than retrogressive policy. So yeah, I think if we have any more questions, and then Kyle was the last one left to make his closing remarks. So I'll just.
I suppose I don't have much to say that hasn't already been said, but one thing that I'd like to enhance is the idea that you should build a community and generate allies and have good relationships, whether that's with your regulator or with, for example, as an exchange, your peers in the industry around you, and society as best you can, because sometimes one voice isn't effective, but many can be. And in our particular case, we would not be here today if it were not for the voices of some of our friends in the industry. So just want to push that.
Yeah, that's. I just want to say to everybody, thank you for the panel. It's even, doing things like this. It's always an education for even for all of us, I think. But I've learned a lot from hearing about some of the history of things happening in the USA, and I've also learned a lot about Chad today. So it's been a fantastic panel. I'd like to thank Jane, Zena, Kyle, and really good discussions. Let's keep talking.